Well, the Burnham bounce is real. This morning, I've woken up, and one of the first things I did this morning was check my phone to see what had happened in the Makerfield by-election. Now, many Americans I know are among my readers and viewers, and they may be a bit confused by what's going on. And I want to talk about this idea of the bounce, what that means for West Streeting, what that means for Keir Starmer, what that means for British politics, actually. Um, and I suppose some of the things I want to talk about today is the idea of loyalty. And that's certainly something that's far bigger than British politics. It's certainly something that comes into the church very often when we think about leadership, and like it or not, I suppose there's a form of politics in churches. But even if you don't want to use the word church politics, you can certainly talk about church leadership and what happens with church leadership and the amount of loyalty that we often encourage to feel towards a leader. And is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? I want to talk a little bit about leadership and leadership style. And I want to talk about hope. So there's quite a lot to cover this morning. And I never thought I'd be doing back-to-back podcasts. I suppose if I was a more, what's the word, formalized or organized blogger, I'd have some kind of klaxon that'd come out here and going, emergency podcast. But it's not an emergency, but it is potentially quite a big changing point for our politics here in the UK. But interestingly as well, potentially for world politics. So let's take a step back for a minute and just talk about what's actually happened and what does this mean and what doesn't it mean. So I think the world is probably pretty familiar now with the way in which we as Brits approach our politics. And we're fairly pragmatic. And increasingly in recent years, the idea of loyalty to the leader who's in place has kind of disappeared. And it's remarkable how quickly in the UK a premiership can end. It's something that really hasn't got parallel in the US, because let's be honest, even Richard Nixon wasn't actually fired by anybody, and he chose to resign. And it's very possible that that's one way out of the current predicament. You say, well, hang on, what predicament? So situation is, let's just take a step backwards, is that Keir Starmer was elected to lead the Labour Party. And so that's really an interesting thing. In the UK, we very much have representative politics, and that's really important. So we don't choose our prime ministers, and some people will be like, "Oh my gosh, we've chosen Keir Starmer, so he should be safe, and we should be loyal to him." And there certainly would be a view, even within the Labour Party, I'm sure, that loyalty is important. We don't challenge a leader. And in fact, Keir Starmer has come out yesterday, so it was before the results of this election, and said that he believed that there should never be a leadership challenge. And I think, first of all, we've got to agree on that there's something kind of wrong, in my view anyway, about the state of affairs in the US political situation, where it doesn't matter how many scandals there are, it seems. It doesn't matter what somebody does. It doesn't matter how many decisions they might make that are wrong, and even how much their health might be declining, and whether or not they're fit to lead. And it seems like the conclusion at the moment, anyway, is loyalty trumps everything. Oh, there's the word Trump. I don't want to make this about Donald Trump, but it is interesting that if you look back in American political history, you have a term that's 4 years, and you can more or less do anything, it would seem, and you'll get to the end of that term. Now, you may not get a second term, but as a directly elected office, the president is quite safe. And you could argue, and I won't in this particular podcast, whether or not you think Trump is the right kind of person to lead. all the right kind of policies to lead, whether he's making the right decisions. And you could point out all kinds of scandals. And I can promise you, almost on a daily basis, certainly on a weekly basis, there's some new scandal about Donald Trump that here in the UK would almost certainly have led to them having to resign. And simple as that, having to resign or be fired. And I guess that's the thing. We do have a system for being fired as Prime Minister, which isn't really there in America for being a president. And so let's go back. It's about here. Oh, it's nice to meet somebody who's watching from East Africa. And I guess, I don't know what Tanzanian politics is like, but in Africa in general, many African countries anyway, this idea of loyalty to the leader is very clear. And you sometimes see leaders in some parts of Africa that have served for decades. So then again, at what point do you go, hang on a minute, you've had your chance, op it? And so in the UK politics, I know I've lost count actually of how many prime ministers we've had since David Cameron. And you can see that that changed everything, really. It was really Brexit that changed everything in the sense that there was a challenge to the status quo. And unusually for the UK, the people were given a very important decision rather than just to elect their representatives to make the decisions for them. And whether you agree with Brexit or not, it certainly gave power to the people to make that choice. David Cameron chose to resign because he didn't get the vote he wanted and because he didn't want to deal with the mess that was going to result. And so, you could almost argue, was he loyal to the country? Should he have carried on? And I guess many people would look back at the David Cameron prime ministership and think, actually, whatever I thought at the time, that was stable times for the UK politics. And the irony, as of today, is that Keir Starmer has a huge majority in Parliament. So under normal rules, you would think that that would mean he was secure. But let me tell you, particularly with this Burnham bounce and the fact that Andy Burnham has been elected, and let me just say, because I probably should have said this at the beginning of the podcast, he hasn't just been elected by a narrow majority, which was almost the most that many people in Labour were hoping for in that election, because he's been elected into a constituency which is very much the heartland of reform. Now, whatever you think about reform, I don't think many people would see them as the party of loyalty. You'd see them as a party potentially of division and of reform. They've split effectively from the Conservatives. It's not quite as simple as that, but it's not. Certainly Nigel Farage and many other leading figures in reform were members of the Conservative Party. And Nigel Farage has a long history, actually, of leading parties that then fracture. And that's happened. And I think many people thought that split would be what helped Andy Burnham sort of squeak through in this by-election to become a member of Parliament. And let's be clear, he's not yet our Prime Minister, but there's a lot of interest about what's going to happen next. And I'll talk you through a bit more of that in a minute. But he's not yet our Prime Minister, but I don't think there's many people that would bet against the idea of him becoming Prime Minister very soon. And I'll explain a bit more about that in a minute. But let's just go back to this whole loyalty division thing and kind of almost a political hotbed of treachery and being a traitor. And Nigel Farage has kind of built a brand on that idea of being almost like a traitor and not being true and loyal to the sort of old system, to the Conservative Party, and splitting. But he's seen splits in his parties before, and there was a split in his party. So Reform UK is right wing. Many people have seen Nigel Farage as kind of like a bit like a British Trump, although some people thought Boris Johnson was that. But he doesn't. He doesn't seem to be right-wing enough for people like Elon Musk. And so Elon Musk has been supporting a party that in a sense has been trying to out-reform, a party called Restore. And, I think some people rather naively thought that a party that's not even 4 months old would win this election because it is sort of reform heartland at the Makerfield constituency and near Greater Manchester in the north. And typically our politicians who lead the country don't come from the north in England. We're quite a South-dominated, London-dominated political scene. So that in itself is quite interesting. And But what's really interesting is this: the split in the Reform Party with this new Restore Party, which Elon Musk has been talking about putting money behind, and certainly he's put, the power of his political platform, and let's call it that, in X behind that. And many people thought that because of splitting the right wing vote, I mean, essentially in this election, anyone who would normally vote Conservative in that constituency was likely to vote for either Reform or Restore. And anyone that voted Labour would obviously vote Labour. And if you looked at the result of the council elections in that area, it looked like it was going to be a Reform sweep, and that Burnham would fail at this attempt to get back into Parliament. And he puts it, lead change in the UK political scene. And so, the facts are, the numbers are in. Burnham got 55% of the vote. And what that means is that, yes, some people did vote for Restore who might have otherwise voted for Reform. But even if all of them had voted for that, and even if the small numbers of people who voted Green or voted Conservative, gosh, we almost forget the Conservatives exist these days, which is remarkable when you think they had 13 years of power. And throughout my lifetime, it's really only Keir Starmer. Well, it is only Keir Starmer, Gordon Brown, and of course Tony Blair, who have led from the Labour side, from the left side. Apart from that, my whole lifetime, and I'm 55, we've had pretty much, I think all exclusively Conservative party. I'm actually just thinking, I'm not sure, what happened immediately before Margaret Thatcher, but I was quite young then. I was only 8. Certainly in my living memory, I've only ever known really, or have majority known Conservative prime ministers. And you see, many people said that you should be loyal, and people like Margaret Thatcher got to about 10 years, and Tony Blair got to about 10 years, but both of them didn't really choose to leave. They left essentially with a knife stabbed in their back. And it's really interesting that the kind of political journey, if you like, of any leader, and this is certainly true to a certain extent all the way around the world, is that you get elected on a promise, on a hope, and there's no question that, I mean, the Burnham bounce doesn't just mean that he dominated this election. And let's be honest, this factor changes everything for the Labour Party potentially, who are languishing in the polls beneath the Reform Party at the moment. If we had an election right now in the UK, the assumption is that Nigel Farage would become our next Prime Minister. And that's certainly not something that fills me with great joy and anticipation, because I think he's a divisive figure. And I think many of the things he wants to say and do are set up sometimes even to stir up trouble. And you could almost argue that he incites violence sometimes, and certainly division, and certainly a form of politics that, well, I mean, Andy Burnham put it in his acceptance speech this morning, that he believes that time for change in our politics has come to avoid us becoming divisive like the Americans, which is interesting because, of course, he's about to potentially directly challenge the leadership of Keir Starmer. And you could argue that was divisive. What's divisive and what's loyal and what's being too loyal? These are the thoughts that are going through my mind at the moment. So going back, we have this Burnham bounce. Burnham has shown that he's got the political nous, got the political popularity to win in a seat that was almost guaranteed to turn Reform. The new Restore Party did better than many people thought, but they didn't actually, even if you added up all the votes, all the different parties, and put them against Andy Burnham, the 55% tells you that he would have won. So he will be welcomed into Westminster by a number of his fellow Labour MPs as some kind of messiah, some kind of king from the north. The idea being that he has been leading Manchester, one of our great cities. We do have other cities other than London, for many years, and he's done some things there which have been very much on the Labour side. So he's taken, for example, the buses into public ownership, and he's tried to improve the buses for people, believing that public transport is a good investment not just for the people, but for business, because it allows people to get around and do jobs and things. And certainly there's been a bit of a bounce in the economy in Manchester. Some people would argue how much is that the result of Burnham and how much of that is just a result of other natural forces. I'm not going to get into that right now, but there's no question that many people in Manchester see him as not quite a political messiah, but certainly as somebody who can get things done. And there is this idea that you get elected on hope, and certainly hope was a word he even used, and change, and this idea, this promise that he will work to make politics better for everyone, so that it's fairer for the people in the north, so that it's fairer for the poor people. And I know some of my Americans will be, oh my gosh, this is socialism. And some American Christians have criticized me for the fact that I guess I'm a centralist, really. But the assumption has been that I'm some kind of left-wing lunatic. And in America, just if you say, for example, like I would do, that public health is very important, and that having a national health service where you can get treated not on the basis of how much money you own, but on the basis of how sick you are, that's really important. And yes, you can argue about whether our NHS is working properly. You can argue that maybe we need to send more money into it. And we can also argue that it needs to be more efficient, and that maybe some business ideas need to be in that provision to make sure that the money is spent wisely. So you can argue about all of that. But I do believe that, well, here's why I'm a centralist. Okay, I mean, we've talked about betrayal and we've talked about loyalty and the divide, and when is it appropriate to be loyal and when is it appropriate to not betray, but to sort of stand up and challenge. And as I said earlier, Keir Starmer said a leadership challenge is never right. And some pastors would say that it's never right to ask for a pastor to leave, that it's never right for people within a church to say, hang on a minute, what you've done here isn't appropriate with your pastoral calling and we want you out. And some people would literally say that doesn't matter what the pastor does, that they have some divine right to stay. And some politicians believe that, and indeed, some politicians in other countries do believe that, and that sort of authoritarianism, that I have some kind of right to do whatever I like, and that how dare you challenge me, is very clear. But there are other sort of dichotomies in politics, and one of them is the dichotomy between business and capitalism and making money. Because let's be honest, if we don't have money, how can we do anything? But this idea that capitalism is what works, I know it was talking about democracy, and Winston Churchill famously said that democracy is the worst possible form of government that ever could be, apart from all the alternatives. And capitalism is a bit like that. Communism has been tried and failed, and let's be honest, communism is a disaster. And one of the reasons it's a disaster is that it doesn't allow for capitalism and the way in which capitalism turns selfishness into gain, not just for that individual, but also hopefully for the community. So, I'm recording this on a smartphone, and it's actually an iPhone. And so I'm giving lots of my money to Apple, but in return, I'm getting a product that, I wouldn't say it makes me happy and excited, but it certainly allows me to do what I want to do. And so we get the benefit. But here's the thing. Capitalism, if left unchecked, leads to massive increases in the inequality. And that's certainly something we've seen in the West in the last few years. And it's one of the reasons for the political unrest that we're seeing, and for the rise of people who, whether they really are or not, like to pretend that they're the champion of the people. I mean, it's laughable sometimes that a billionaire in Trump, and that someone who in Farage received £5 million as a nice donation just before starting again as an MP, can really say that they're sort of somehow people that they somehow understand what it's like to be poor, and that they're somehow representing the ordinary people. I mean, it's kind of laughable, isn't it? But they can tap into the sense that many people have, that the world has not been fair for them, that they are oppressed, that opportunities are not available for them, sometimes just because of where they live, sometimes because of the color of their skin, sometimes because of how wealthy their parents were, irrespective of their nationality. And so this idea that the world is passing you by, that it's no longer possible to just get a job, do well, get a house, um, buy a nice car, that those kind of things become unachievable for people who, even for people who are working hard. And so, capitalism unchecked seems to lead to trillionaires. We've just had the first trillionaire, and it seems to lead to poverty. And so, what we do seem to need is, on the one hand, yes, good old capitalism, go capitalism, and that would be a sort of right wing approach. And some degree of conservatism, perhaps socially as well, it would be a typical right wing thing. And many Christians would believe that. They would say, well, look, we do need to have human responsibility. We do need to have, people being encouraged to make money and look after themselves. And I have nothing against any of that. And conservative values, I mean, you can argue to what extent the state should be legislating for how we live. That's an interesting question. But certainly you can be in favour of conservative values. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we should just leave things unchecked. And so that's why, on the other hand, some form of socialism, if you want to call it that, seems to be important. Some form of regulation on these big organizations that are making loads of money, some form of protection for workers' rights, some form of support for workers or for people who aren't able to work or who can't get a job, some form of, some people now are talking increasingly about the idea of a basic income, a universal basic income, which is interesting because that's something that even Elon Musk on the right has been talking about as a possibility. But so basically you've got left and you've got right. And for me, I think our politics over here at least has worked quite well when we swung to the left for a while, regulated a bit more, spent a bit more on our services and tried to look after people a bit better. And then perhaps sometimes we go a bit too far on that. We spend a bit too much money and the right come in and go, hang on, we need to be fiscally responsible. Hang on, are we really being pro-business? So you have that kind of to and fro with British politics. But Burnham tries to be pro-business, but also pro-justice, if you like, pro the people, the poor people, pro the North, which often in this country are the same thing. Opportunities are often far less for people who live in the North than for those of us who live in the South. So, there's all kinds of division there as well, North v South, black v white, rich v poor, wealthy, upper class or middle class people who look down on those who actually have just been less fortunate than you. It's not that you're necessarily better than them or even, and that's one of the myths, and I won't go into that, but I recently spoke a bit about that, about how, God actually humbles the rich, but honors the poor. And some of our political systems kind of do the opposite. But anyway, going back to this whole thing, we've had the Burnham bounce. We know now that he really is, politically sort of, he's got that Midas touch. But why is that? And I think, he's at the moment in this wave of hope that has led to him being elected against the odds with such a huge turnout in the Makerfield by-election and such a huge percentage of the votes, 55%. That's quite impressive. And so it's very easy that he gets welcomed in, as I spoke about earlier, as some kind of almost political messiah from the North, the King of the North, and that he's going to come in to Westminster. And, one possible chain of events is that pretty much every MP or a very high majority of MPs say, actually, Starmer, we want him to be leader. And if enough of them say that, I think it's 81, then there has to be a challenge. Starmer has said he will fight. But if a huge number of them said they want Burnham to be the next prime minister, if a huge number of them say that, and if cabinet ministers start resigning and saying that, then it's possible Starmer may have to just retire, and that's certainly what happened with a number of our previous prime ministers, where they realised their number was up and they just left. So, I'm not saying this will happen, but Starmer could just as choose to walk away. And in those circumstances, I wouldn't be surprised if Burnham, as a sort of unifying figure, as he wants to see himself, has offered him, say, the foreign ministry. I don't know if he'd take it, but we've had a previous prime minister as a foreign minister before, and certainly Starmer was popular on the world stage. But anyway, who knows what will happen? And there's a suspicion that Streeting may have done a deal already with Burnham, or if he hasn't, that's in the cards, and that perhaps if you had a Burnham and Streeting, so we're Streeting, the ex-health secretary here, I heard somebody suggesting perhaps Streeting will be Chancellor. You heard it here first. But I don't know. But there's going to be all this backroom deals and then potentially a formal contest. But you get elected on a sort of wave of popularity in the UK, and it's the same in many other places. Perhaps hope, belief that change is coming, and then you hit the realities of how difficult it is in this modern world with all the challenges that we face. Brexit, the damage that COVID did our economies, the issues around the Strait of Hormuz, and all sorts of other challenges that we face that are not necessarily in control of our politicians, but that they're going to get blamed for. So we've got all of that going on, and eventually people turn on you, and eventually your career seems to end, certainly in the UK, in ignominy and failure. So what will happen to Burnham? Is he at the beginning of that stage? So he will probably challenge Starmer, and Starmer may step aside for him, or Starmer may fight. But if he does become Prime Minister, does this mean that Labour will experience the Burnham bounce? That although we're not going to have an election for a few years, will it give him a chance to actually get some things done, to try and manage the country? He has the passion and the charisma and the communication ability that I'm afraid to say, whatever you think about his politics, Keir Starmer just doesn't seem to have. And most people agree that you are looking for two things in a politician: competence, and sometimes it looks like Starmer doesn't really have that. Although I think we're a little bit too harsh on him on that front. But I don't think even his friends would dispute that. If you were weighing up somebody like Andy Burnham and somebody like him on the charisma stakes, that he just wouldn't have it. And it does seem that in the modern communication world, you've got to be able to communicate. And certainly it's well worth looking at Andy Burnham's acceptance speech and perhaps one of his campaign videos. I remember being very moved actually by the Andy Burnham campaign video. It was a very clever piece of political theatre, whatever you agree, whether you disagree. I'm not going to really get into that, but into the policies, because actually we don't even know what some of Andy Burnham's policies will be, whether he'll just carry on with the Labour policies as per now, whether he'll do some different things. But what we do seem to know is that he's likely to be much more engaging in his communication, and therefore potentially stirring up people's hope. And I guess he will be hoping that before the next general election in a few years' time, he will have the opportunity to prove that it's not just a false hope, that he can deliver on some of his promises. But there you go. I guess I haven't really answered all the questions, but I have raised them. When does being loyal, when's that a bad idea? I mean, some people would say, just from a strategic point of view, it seems clear that Starmer's not going to win the next general election unless some sort of miracle happens. And the Burnham camp might argue that he's perhaps that miracle. So get out of the way, Starmer, because we don't want reform and all the division that would entail to be our next government. Some people would argue that. But some people would say, you're not being loyal. But it's interesting, isn't it? Loyalty, I think, has its limits. And there are times where, whether you're talking about politics or whether you're talking about a local church, it's right to stand up to the leader and say enough is enough. And I do wonder this morning, with this huge result of Andy Burnham, how many people are going to be saying to Keir Starmer, it's time to step aside. And we'll see. We'll see that sort of, no doubt. People may come to different conclusions. Some have already said to him, we don't want you as our leader anymore. And I think that may become more explicit. Or we may see a very damaging, divisive election, or it's possible there may be almost no election, just the MPs as a whole saying, no, we want Burnham to be our leader now. So there we go. As a normal member of the public, you might feel, well, the decision's been taken out of your hands. Well, we don't live in a direct democracy where there are lots of referendums. The Swiss do that. We live in a democracy where we elect our representatives, and like it or not, a few years ago, we elected a bunch of Labour MPs, and it will be up to them. Ultimately, it'll be up to them whether or not Starmer carries on limping as a leader, or whether Burnham gets elected, not on a wave of the public's enthusiasm, although certainly there was enthusiasm seen in the Makerfield by-election, but on the wake of the decisions of our representatives. So our representatives have now got to decide, and we'll find out what happens. So there you go. I don't know how coherent that's been. I hope it's been of some interest, and I don't know what's going to happen. But I guess if I was a betting man, and I'm not a betting man, I kind of have a feeling that Burnham is quite a wily political operator, and it's possible that there won't even be an election to become the Prime Minister, but that everyone will stand aside for him, even including Keir Starmer. I may be wrong about that, and we may see the battle. But we'll find out as the time keeps coming. And for those of us who like a bit of political drama and a bit of political theatre, pull out your popcorn. Let's see what happens, even just in the next week or so. Okay, bye everyone.